In 150 years of Ontario history, there have been only 25 people who have sat in that corner office on the second floor at Queen's Park and been called Premier. It is arguably the second hardest job in Canadian politics, and two of the people who've had that job join us now to reflect on this campaign and presumably the difficulty of vacating that office not of your own choosing. And so we welcome the 20th Premier of Ontario, David Peterson, and the 23rd Premier of Ontario, Ernie Eves. Gentlemen, good to have you in those chairs.
Pleasure to be here.
I want you to just think back on the past 28 days. David Peterson, to you first, and tell me what the most startling thing was for you about this campaign.
I think how unhappy everybody is. Liberals have their problems, the NDP have their problems, the Tories have their problems, and I don't see a coalescing of enthusiasm. It's all people. It seems to me a lot of people are going to vote. The people that do vote are going to vote reluctantly, most with reservations. And I think, and that speaks, I guess, for a little more precarious state of democracy. Democracy needs hope. It needs something positive to draw it forward. I don't see much positive in this campaign.
Ernie Eves, how about you?
Well, I think that the majority of Ontarians, and I think there was a forum poll recently that said, 74% are not happy with any of the choices they have, which is a pretty startling number. I mean, you would think that might be 35 or 40%, but not 74%. So I think each party and each leader has their own baggage to carry in this election. And now you're facing, with all due respect, I think Kathleen Wynne's actually acknowledged she can't win or is not going to win. And you have a pretty dramatic choice, really, between the NDP and how much money they may spend and what's that going to mean to the long-term Ontario economy. And then you have Rob Ford, who a lot of people would perceive as being, Doug Ford, who a lot of people would perceive as being too far right and too out there. Mm-hmm. And there's no really moderate, mushy middle candidate running.
I don't know if you saw the Globe and Mail editorial this morning, but they declined to endorse anybody. They basically said, pick the best person in your riding.
I think it spoke very well to the hopelessness in a lot of people's minds. And Ernie talked about the numbers. But I find, and then I think probably voting will be down. I hope not, but it probably will.
Actually, Vance polling is up 20%.
Yeah,
well,
go figure.
Who knows how this is going to turn out. But everybody is sort of holding their nose on this one.
I want the two of you to get a little personal for a moment now, because, well, you have both been, in some respects, in Kathleen Wynne's shoes, in as much as we're 24 hours before Election Day, and my hunch is both of you knew you were going to lose on Election Day. Ernie Eves, to you first. What are these last 24 hours like when you know you're about to lose?
Well, you know, the 2003 campaign, as you recall, I was conscripted by my good buddy Bob Runciman and several other colleagues. I had retired to the private sector, and they convinced me to come back and run. I knew it was going to be a difficult election. I knew what the politics were, if you will, what the numbers were. I think a lot of people were fed up with 8 years of the current government and wanted to change, and that's not unusual. And I think Kathleen Wynne's going through the same thing right now. But you do the best that you can do. You believe in what you're campaigning for and what your principles are and what you stand for. And you owe it to the people of Ontario and the people of your party and your candidates to put forth the best face you can. Yes, I certainly knew that the likelihood of me winning was slim to none, but you still have to go out there and do it every day. I think you become at peace with it after a while, and I think Kathleen Wynne has demonstrated that in this current campaign.
Okay, your take.
Kathleen started in tough shape in this campaign and hasn't been able to elevate it, and made a move that surprised everybody, including me. And when I first saw it, I thought, man, why would someone do this? And when I thought about it, it was actually quite a selfless act. She came to the conclusion the issue for the Liberals was her, not so much the government. And so she threw herself, in a sense, under the bus and say, elect some Liberals, keep the middle still in politics, should we say the rational middle of the traditional space of the Liberal Party. Don't let it just go to the extremes, weigh the two parties one of which will be in government, presumably. And so it's a last-ditch plea. And I thought it was quite a selfless act.
Well,
now, in my own case.
You didn't do that, though.
Yeah, but I wasn't sure about that. My campaign only deteriorated in the last few days. I was winning until the end, and then I think the reason we won, people didn't like me, the same reason, and that happens in politics. But it was far too close and too soon. We weren't facing being expunged, and we still had a fighting chance. And then what we tried to do is say, look, here's the reality. The NDP could win, and they could be the government, and they're incapable of being the government. I think they proved the point. But that's always after the fact. And that's part of the debate right now. Who can run? You alluded to the second biggest job in this country, Stephen. Who has the capacity to run this government? Who has the team? Who's got the experience? This is not uncomplicated. You can't just take a few people off a turnip truck and run a government this large and this complex. Ernie, I don't know if this is still true, but when I was there, if Ontario was a separate country, it would have been the 11th largest in the world in terms of GDP. You just look, that's bigger than most countries in the world. Think of it that way. In the most decentralized country, arguably, in the world, you look at the enormous number of levers you have, the number of power you have, and you need capable, thoughtful people to administrate this great province.
Do you, or I guess I should say, at what point do you start to think, here we are 24 hours before Election Day, harken back to your time in 2003, 24 hours before Election Day, do you think, what the hell am I going to do now? You know, I've had a great job and now it's over, and what am I going to do now?
No, well, I didn't think about that at all. Speaking of 24 hours before Election Day, our last daily polling showed who would Ontarians like, but who's the most qualified to be the premier? Ernie Eves was 58%. Time for a Change was 61%. These are the same people you're polling. So that sent a very clear message to me.
How does that make any sense, though?
Well, no, but it does and it doesn't. It does in the sense that I think people get tired of governments. Governments become complacent. I don't care which political stripe. There's a sense of entitlement that sets in. And, you know, with all due respect to the current government, it's no different than any other government. And over the 15 years, I think there have been lots of issues, if you want to, you know, going from the gas plant scandal to whatever, that have ticked off the Ontario voter. And they decided, I believe, I've said this constantly for about a year, they decided a year ago the current government was not getting reelected. Now, what logical choice do we have, or what is our preference as to who we're going to elect to go forward? Speaking of a team, you know, I think, as I said, each one of the parties brings some baggage to the table, and you have to sort of get past that and communicate with as many people as you can. And I do think that Ford has a really good team around him of people who could be really decent cabinet ministers. I think one of the problems that Andrea has, and I like Andrea quite a bit actually, she's a very decent person, has been there for a while, but one of the problems she has, especially in recent days, have been the 12 or 13 candidates that have said some pretty weird, nasty things about everything ranging from police to Canadian war veterans. These things are not acceptable. Do you want those people running your government sitting around the cabinet table?
You raised one thing there I want to follow up with you, and that is that as far as Mr. Eves was concerned, this election just never was winnable for the Liberals. Kathleen Wynne was in that chair the other day, and she said, I still think I could have won had I caught a break here or there. What do you think?
You always live with hope. I mean, politics is a bit like religion. You always hope for something better, and that's the appeal that it has for people, and you have to capture that hope, which she did not do. But we have to believe it ourselves. As leaders, you have to believe that you can get in there and fight, and until you're absolutely confronted with reality. So I think she probably believed that. Ernie didn't, and the polls wouldn't have said that. But let me tell you something else. These polls, politics and life would be a lot better without polls. Because the polls will tell you this. The polls will tell you people want lower taxes, more services, and a balanced budget. And they don't, the person who's responding to the poll doesn't have the responsibility of balancing all these competing pressures you have in public life. That's the job of the party and the leadership, and to explain that. And I honestly believe some of the worst mistakes I've made in politics, and some of the worst mistakes some of my colleagues have made in politics, we're listening to the polls every night. Polls tell you about the past. They tell you about people's wants. They don't tell you about people's needs. And you've got to articulate that in a way that attracts you. It's hard, but that's the job of leadership. And I think this was far too poll-orientated, and I say it to all of my colleagues.
I think one of the big problems is that, our system of government, no system is perfect, is really every 4 years you have to go back to the people. And people being people, human beings, they look forward to 4 years. And all too often decisions are made by political parties of all stripes on what's going to be good for me 4 years from now, or a party, or 8 years from now. But they don't look 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road, mostly because a lot of those decisions would be very unpopular in the short term, but very beneficial in the long term. And it speaks to the point that David was just making, I believe, in that, you have to have some belief in what you are doing that is in the best interest, the long-term best interest of Ontarians and Canadians. And I think, I don't care which party you come from, I've said this a gazillion times, I spent 24 years in the legislature of Ontario. I can't think of maybe one or two people that weren't there for the right reasons. They're all there to try and make the province a little bit better for the people that live in it. They just have a different way of going about trying to achieve that goal. Nobody wants to denigrate or cut healthcare or education or anything else. And to suggest otherwise is, quite frankly, absolutely ludicrous. It's just politicking.
Yeah, but it's where you put your emphasis,
is,
Ernie. I mean, some it's put more on fiscal rectitude, and there's lots of different nuance inside of it. What you're seeing in this debate is, in my opinion, is something that people don't understand. The so-called fiscal right-wingers are saying, okay, the Tories are my man, but look at the promises. Look at their financial promises. They are, in many ways, more irresponsible than what, in my opinion, than what the NDP are doing.
I was going to ask you about that.
The incapacity to finance this. And here you have a man who's leading this party, arguably the least qualified person that's ever aspired to the premiership of this country. Never sat in the legislature, doesn't know how a bill is formed, has now got all these other persons. You can just watch on any question of substance how little, let me be careful, time he has had to delve into these issues, now to deal with these issues.
And yet he's in first place in the polls.
Well, and he could well be. And I think this speaks to big things that are going on in our society, like happening in the United States. And I think we could discuss that in the age of social media, and how people get angry and they express themselves, and how the blind loyalty to certain kinds of concepts. But let me tell you, looking ahead, it's awfully hard to be very optimistic.
Well, let me put that to you, Mr. Eves, because, as a guy who brought out, when you were finance minister, 6 budgets?
Yes.
6 budgets. What do you think about the fact that the PC party this time has no officially costed platform and has basically run on a bunch of ideas that, a lot of economists think really don't add up at all?
Well, excuse me, when I go back to 1995, virtually every economist in Ontario disagreed with our platform, the Mike Harris platform. They said, you can't possibly reduce taxes by 31% on average, et cetera, and not destroy the province. The reality is, we increased revenue by almost doubling it. The reality is we more than doubled healthcare expenditures in those 8 years. The reality is we launched the largest capital expenditure in post-secondary education history in the province of Ontario.
So we shouldn't be too fussed about this?
No, first of all, nobody knows, except for perhaps the current government, what the true state of the books of the province are.
Or the Auditor General.
Right. And the current government vehemently disagrees with what the Auditor General says the current state of the economy is. And you have really Kathleen Wynne, I believe, and I like Kathleen Wynne, don't get me wrong, personally, I have a lot of time for her. And anybody who's been in that job knows what it's like. But, she decided that she was going to pull a Trudeau, I believe, and outflank the NDP on the left about a year ago. And then, much to her surprise, Horvath decided she was going to, well, I can do one better than you. If you're going to have a $12 billion deficit, I can have a $20 or $30 billion deficit, and you're going to have free daycare for people 2.5 above. I'm going to have free daycare for everybody. You're going to have free dental care for seniors and kids. I'm going to have free dental care for everybody. Blah, 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 blah.
Exactly.
That's all very nice. Nobody's against daycare.
I don't want to be
Nobody's
partisan,
against.
Ernie, but just look at what Doug Ford is saying in the revenue cuts and in the expenditures. If you think the NDP are irresponsible, and actually I think they are, so are the Tories, is what I'm saying. This is what's happening. It's almost a race to irresponsibility. And that's another thing that bothers me about this campaign. And you only know after the fact whether they can make this work. I can guarantee you they can't make it work. And so we're whatever happens, we're going to face some very serious issues and some coming back from where they were. I don't care who wins this election.
You don't care who wins this election?
No, I don't. No, I do care, but I don't. No, I honestly don't know who's going to win this election, and it's not going to be the Liberals.
Right.
So then the question is the other two. I don't know, and I can give you. I kind of feel like the Globe and Mail today. I don't know. I'll give you a case for either one of them, but I do think this has to be done in a sound, fiscal way, and I don't see it.
Okay, let's do some more first-person stuff here, taking you back in time. Mr. Eves, at what point, after an election is over, do you, as Premier, stop saying to yourself, if only I'd done this differently, maybe we could have caught a break in one, or if only I'd done that instead of done this, maybe we would have had a better
I think
outcome?
human nature being what it is, you always go back and think about things you could have done better. You always want to improve on what you've done. I don't care what it is. But especially in this case, it's very, very important to the province of Ontario. In my personal case, I think that perhaps if we'd have waited another year and people got to know Ernie Eves a little bit better, I think we might have done a lot better. But we'll never know because I didn't do that.
This was the days when there was no fixed election date.
Right.
You could call the election when you wanted.
And we decided that we owed it to the people of Ontario to go back to the people after 4 years. We could have waited 5. Bob Ray tried that. It didn't work too well for him.
Should have tried 3, Ernie.
Or you tried 3. That didn't work either. So anyway,
Actually, you know what?
Maybe nothing works, Ernie. Maybe
It's funny you say that because I think your example spooked him. You went after 3 years, from 1987, you called it 1990 after 3 years, and that became conventional wisdom that you don't go early because look what happened to David Peterson. Did that spook you at the time?
Well, I was, quite frankly, I was so busy dealing with some major problems in the province, ranging from 2 bouts of SARS to mad cow disease to a northeastern North American blackout. I wasn't...
hydro rates.
Hydro rates. Well, there's always hydro issue, and that's another... We could do a whole program on hydro.
I just want to remind people that it's been around for a long time.
We could do a whole program on hydro. But the reality is that, you always think back as to what you could have done better, but I think the long and the short of it for me is that I think the people had decided, like in this election, they had enough of the current government, and the current government was going no matter how much they liked or didn't like the leader.
Like on the chance Kathleen Wynne is watching this, based on your own experience, tell her how long it will take before she stops saying to herself, if only.
Psychologists will tell you, Stephen, if something dramatic happens in your life, it takes a couple of years to, in personal terms, get over these things. I'm talking about you lose a job or a divorce or a bankruptcy or losing, depending on and very personal terms. So the question is, how do people handle that? And it diminishes over time. It's like a death in the family, and you mourn these things. And Ernie's right. You sit there and say, what could I have done differently? Because one of the things I believe in totally is personal moral responsibility. We lost, it was my fault. You don't blame anybody else. I can have my own views. If I took bad advice, it was my fault, not the people's fault that gave me the advice. So you wear that. And the answer is you decide how to move on in your own life. And I'm lucky. I have a wonderful family and a wonderful wife, and they love me just as much when I lose as when I win, and as I do for them. And so you get through that, and then you say there's many other constructive ways to win your life. And then remember, this isn't about me. Nobody cares if I'm whining or feel sorry for myself. Let's go on and try to make the world a better place in different ways.
But you lost the election on September 6th, 1990. You weren't thinking that on September 7th.
No.
How long did it take before you started thinking that
September,
way?
well, actually, I thought that way intellectually. Emotionally, it took a little longer. But when I lost the election to September the 6th, my wife, interestingly enough, started a television series the very next day. She had to be on the set. So we lost the election. We were in London, Ontario, in my house. She drove to Toronto at 4 in the morning. You can imagine the strength of character she has. Started shooting a television series and shot it for that year. So I looked after the kids. And I started to teach.
So you had a job.
Well, I had a job, and Shelley was making more money than I ever made in my life. And so I was a house dad, and so it kind of worked very well for me personally. And I had a great time with the kids and started to teach and then started to build another career.
I phoned Dalton McGuinty, obviously the night of the election, but I phoned him the next morning and said, all right, let's plan when you can take over this thing. And I said, look, the people have spoken. You're my premier now. You are the premier of the province of Ontario. I think that's what is some sort of lost in today's politics. It's become so polarized that people at opposite ends of the spectrum don't even talk to each other anymore in a lot of cases. If the Liberals suggest it, the Conservatives say it must be bad, or vice versa. If the Conservatives have a good idea, well, that can't possibly be good for us. And I don't, when I arrived at Queen's Park, we were talking about Bob Nixon earlier before we went on the air. I used to have dinner with Bob Nixon and Eli Martell from time to time.
Your Minister of
and
Finance.
we discuss issues and how we could get legislation through the legislature and how we could accomplish something. And if you had to compromise here and there to get it done, you did it. They don't do that anymore.
No, those days are gone.
The world has changed totally since times when Ernie and I were there. And there was a modicum of respect. We wouldn't use a word. If you called a guy a liar,
yeah, that was a big deal.
It was a big deal.
You hear it all the time now.
You hear it just go complicated. Those are things my mother taught me not to say when I was 4 years old.
I want to thank the two of you for coming in, sharing your memories of your time, perhaps a more civil time in public life. And thanks for sharing your advice for the current cast of characters that are in there now. David Peterson and Ernie Eves.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.